Hi, everyone, and welcome to episode 161 of the Medieval Podcast. I'm Danièle Cebulski, also known as the 5-Minute Medievalist. I don't know about you, but as someone whose work is firmly based in the written and spoken word, I'm always ridiculously excited to learn about the new ways in which scientists are contributing to our knowledge about the past. When I heard about a new scientific technique and the ways it can reveal how a particular protective object was used, I jumped at the opportunity to bring this information to you. This week, I spoke with Dr. Sarah Fiddyment about biocodicology and birth girdles. Sarah is a research associate at the MacDonald Institute for Archaeological Research at Cambridge University, where she works on the Beasts to Craft project, a study that brings the latest in biomolecular research to medieval books in order to find out how they're made and what they're made of. She's the co-author of many publications, including one that we all may need to read, entitled So You Want to Do Biocodicology? A Field Guide to the Biological Analysis of Parchment, which was featured in Heritage Science. Our conversation on the mind-blowingly simple way of collecting biological information from parchment, what it can tell us, and what it reveals specifically about a late medieval birth girdle is coming up right after this. Well, thank you, Sarah, for coming on to talk about your work on birth girdles. You are the first biocodicologist on the podcast, and I'm so excited to have you here. Welcome.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure.
So I heard you talking about birth girdles at Kalamazoo this year, and I'm really excited to find out about your work on birth girdles. So let's start at the beginning. Can you tell us what a birth girdle is?
Yes. So birth girdles were essentially girdles that could be made from different materials. Could be silk, could be some are metal, some are parchment. So the ones we're interested in are made of parchment. They're like long and thin, up to about 3 and a bit meters long. And they were used by medieval women during their pregnancy and childbirth to act as a sort of talisman or charm to keep them safe from what could be quite a dangerous time. So they are thought to be quite long because they would actually be wrapped around the pregnant woman, acting as a sort of girdle, both talismanically but physically to support them and to help them during pregnancy and childbirth.
And this one particular that you were looking at for this project, it was made in the late 15th century in England, and it's kind of miraculous in some ways that it survives. What happened to birth girdles right after the Middle Ages?
Yes, so we have the Reformation in the 1540s in England. And as part of that, we have the dissolution of the monasteries. So there was a destruction of, lots of the old Catholic relics, talismans, iconic images. And one of the first things they would target are birth girdles, particularly because they are predominantly obviously for women. They venerate saints specific for women, for childbirth. So they were very much targeted and the majority were destroyed. So only a handful seem to have escaped the Reformation.
Yeah, it seems to me like this would be something that women would want to keep and secret away because it's so important to them. I think you're mentioning in your paper, which we're going to link for everybody to look at, that the mortality rates for women in childbirth were huge, perhaps up to 60%, right?
Yes, I mean, it's very, very hard to calculate, but yes, certainly it was one of the most important issues that was going to affect women's health. Throughout history, it's still obviously a very important factor in lots of countries, but it would have been something that they necessarily wouldn't have owned. It would have probably been owned by the churches or the monasteries, and they would have loaned them out or rented them out as and when people wanted them and would pay presumably a nominal fee. You would also probably have different categories. So richer people would probably have a more prestigious item and you would probably get more affordable versions. But it was used on this sort of rented out basis and then kept in the church, basically.
So we've been talking about the talismanic properties of this, the religious properties of this. Can you describe this birth girdle to us, this particular one? What has it got on it? Is it just plain parchment? What does it look like?
Yeah, so you can imagine it's very long and thin. It's about 10 centimeters wide, but it's about 3.3 meters long, incredibly long. It's made up of 4 separate pieces of parchment that have been glued together. And this one is actually unusual. It has writing on both sides of the girdle. And it's written in English, and it includes prayers. There are more specific prayers, more general prayers just for safety and to protect people, to have the sort of amulet effect, but there are specific prayers to do with childbirth and for women. And it also has images, again, would have been images of the cross, of the blood of Christ, various images that would have been used for sort of talismanic effect. This particular birth girdle is very interesting because it has very clear signs of use. So you can see that some of these images are actually quite worn away in the text too, which probably indicates people kissing them or rubbing them in the hope of sort of like this charm, this talismanic effect. And it also seems to be sort of stained and abraded. So it has a lot of visual evidence, shall we say, that it was actually used and not just put in a box like a relic and kept. So that's why this particular girdle is very interesting to us.
Yeah, I imagine it's got all sorts of interesting patterns of wear. And in the article, you're talking about different folds and things like that. So it's got to be something that has had some use over time, which is really interesting if you think about it, narrowly escaping the dissolution of the monasteries, because that would have given it, I think, something like only a few decades of possible use in the Middle Ages.
Yeah, so it's estimated to have been made just before the 1500s, so late 1400s, because of the dissolution of the monasteries. I mean, realistically, it probably had about 60 years of use. However, we do know that even post-Reformation, there is some evidence of these girdles being used in a sort of clandestine manner. So they would have been kept secretly and used secretly, which could have been the case with this girdle. We can't prove it, but there is evidence that these girdles were used up until sort of the mid-17th century. So there's a possibility of about up to a maximum of 150 years use.
Yeah. And even though people are using saints perhaps a little bit less in a Protestant England afterwards, like I said, it seems logical that you want to hedge your bets as much as possible.
Very much so. And something that was so particularly dangerous for women, but still needed. And also, post-Reformation, we did go through some Catholic monarchs, some Protestant monarchs. So it wasn't always that clear, what was allowed and not. So there would have still been like this clandestine use available.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so you were working in a team of people and you are the science person. So
I am.
So let's get into the science. If you want to find out what's going on with a piece of parchment, how do you do it without ruining the parchment?
That's a really good question. And that's one that we have been dealing with for quite a while. So we developed a new non-invasive technique. Well, I say new, it's been around for about 10 years now. I worked with conservation departments back when I was in the University of York in the Borthwick Archive, and we worked with the conservators there to look at methods of non-invasively analysing parchment. So we knew when you're working with books and manuscripts, hardly anybody's going to allow you to come in with some scissors and say, I'm just going to take like a little sliver of this. Which is funny because, as working in an archaeology department, we're very used to being able to drill holes through bones and scrape people's teeth. And nobody seems to worry that much, even for very highly prestigious people. But for documents, it's completely different. For manuscripts and documents, there is very much protected status, and you really cannot take destructive sampling. So I went to work with the conservators, and we looked at different methods that they use routinely to clean parchment when needed for displaying documents, etc. So we tried out a whole host of different methods, and we just stumbled across one which worked really, really well, which are PVC erasers, basically. There's a particular brand that's, accepted by the conservation community. And all we do is we take like a tiny fragment of these erasers, we wipe it gently on the surface of the parchment, and we collect all the little crumbs that you generate and you usually blow away when you're like rubbing out a mistake. Well, those are the little crumbs we collect. We take those back to the lab and we're able to extract proteins, which is what I work with, but we can also extract DNA from it. And you can do, a whole suite of analysis.
This was one of the things that really stood out to me when I heard you speak at Kelms. It was like, these erasers, you find them everywhere, and it turns out that they are the secret of the universe.
For my work, they really are.
That's amazing. So you were telling me earlier that this was originally developed to figure out what kind of parchment people are using, right? So how does this work to figure out what parchment we're talking about?
Exactly. So this method was actually developed to answer the question that was given to us by quite a few people of, can you tell us from what animals these parchment documents are made from? And we said, well, yes, we can. It's quite easy. Using proteins, you can do a very simple methodology called peptide mass fingerprinting. So basically, you take the protein from the parchment. So parchment is basically animal skin. And the main protein in any form of skin is collagen. So that's what we're taking out. We're taking out that collagen protein, and then we're chopping it up into these small fragments, and then we're going to analyze it using mass spectrometry. And very simply, all that's going to do is it's going to measure the mass of these little fragments. They have different masses, and it gives you like a unique fingerprint for each species. So then by comparing those to all these available species, you can say, oh, look, this matches a sheep, a goat, calf, etc. So it was initially developed just for that purpose. And thanks to it being a non-invasive technique, we've been able to analyze thousands and thousands of parchments in this way. And it's been a really exciting project.
It is exciting. Can we just take a sidebar, and can I ask you, why do people want to find out if it's a sheep or a calf? Why does that matter to people?
They have different reasons. So there can be a conservation reason, because initially people were trying to match up repairs, for example. So if you had a calf parchment, you would want to use like a calf repair. Although we very much in the conservation community very much argues against that now, because if you match up that species and subsequently a biocodicologist wants to come along and target that, you will have a confused signal. So we're actually very much in favor of using very different species. We normally recommend things like isinglass that comes from fish. So there's no conflict in that signal. From a manuscript analysis sort of point of view, from the manuscript scholars, there was various reasons. What kind of animals are being used for certain types of books? Is there, a prestige question? Is it reflecting local economies, so livestock economies you can start to track? Because obviously, in the case of calf, you're using very young animals, so this would affect the economics of your livestock. How many animals are you using? How many go into a book? Things like that. So, there's various reasons, and as we've been doing this work, we've come up with some quite interesting results that we didn't initially expect. So yeah, it's been quite eye-opening, really.
I just wanted to dive into that because I think that might be a question that people would have. Why do you need to know? But it really tells us so much about ecology and economy, and I think that's really important. Okay, back to birth girdles. This one that you looked at, what is it made of?
So this birth girdle, so the boring bit was looking at the species. So it's actually made of sheepskin parchment. So the 4 pieces that we identified are all sheepskin, which actually it makes perfect sense. Sheepskin parchment is actually very common in England because of the amount of sheep. It's a very important economic product for us in the Middle Ages. It's also cheaper than calfskin, so it's an affordable product. But more importantly, sheepskin is actually thinner than calf parchment, so it would lend itself to be folded and wrapped in the use of the girdle. So yeah, it made perfect sense for it to be that, but it is sheepskin.
All right. Now that we've established that, let's get into the exciting bits. What did you find on it? What kind of stuff did you find when you started looking at the little crumbs of eraser from this birth girdle?
So once we'd excluded the collagen, so that was looking at the skin protein, we started to look at what other proteins we could see on the surface of this document. And we found a whole suite of proteins. So we found human proteins and non-human proteins. In the non-human proteins, we found things like honey, we found milk, we found egg yolk and egg white, and we also found leguminous plants and cereals. So we found a whole suite of proteins. And then for the human ones, we found quite a lot of evidence of human proteins, which we matched up with different tissues to see if it could give us an idea of how this had been used. And actually, the tissue that it most resembled was cervicovaginal fluid. So it would seem to indicate that this girdle was worn in close proximity of pregnant women.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I want to get to the human stuff last because it's the most exciting thing for me. It sounds like there's a whole grocery list of stuff that is found on this. Can you walk us through what some of these ingredients must have been used for or possibly were used for?
Yes, so we have evidence for all of the proteins that we found. There is contemporary written documentary evidence that they were used as treatments for pregnant or birthing women. So there's 2 particular books that my colleagues have been using as references, the Trotula and the Sickness of Women. And all of these ingredients can be found either individually or in combination as recipes to treat different ailments relating to gynecological problems, pregnancy and labour. So it's not surprising in a way. I mean, to be fair, they are also common ingredients. So the same way that honey can be used as a medical ingredient, which it often is for very many remedies, it can also be a food. But the fact that we found all of these different cereals and plants and milk, and they all appeared in recipes relating to women, was very exciting because it all seemed to point the evidence in the same direction.
Yes, when you were saying in your paper at Kalamazoo that you found honey, I was immediately thinking this is in pretty much every medical book for every medical ailment, and pregnancy is no exception. Not that it's an ailment, but it's something that sometimes you want to treat a little bit. Yeah. One of the things that was exciting that you found too was you mentioned eggs. Now, how is this revelatory? Because eggs you can find around parchment sometimes. How is this different?
Yes. So in the case of eggs, egg white in particular can be used as a surface treatment to make parchment. However, one of the things we found here was not just egg white, it was egg yolk as well. So we found 2 distinct proteins for egg yolk and at least 2 proteins for egg white. And this is actually to highlight one of the benefits of protein analysis versus DNA analysis, which people are more familiar with. In this particular case, we can tell you that we found egg yolk and egg white because of the proteins. They're slightly different. If we were doing DNA analysis, all we would say is we found chicken, but you wouldn't be able to say anything other than that. So using proteomics allows you to have this like tissue specificity. So we can see that we have, yes, both the egg yolk and white, which means it's much more unlikely to be a surface treatment. Finding the egg yolk is a lot more evidence that it was actually an external ingredient that was being used as a remedy.
Yes. And one of the things that is mentioned in the paper, and possibly by your colleagues, because I know that you were telling me that you do the proteins and they do the manuscript research, but eggs are slippery and you need slippery things to sometimes help you deliver a baby. So this is an interesting thing. It could be used externally. It could be used kind of internally as a way of helping delivery, right?
Yes. And what's interesting is actually a lot of these ingredients have multiple purposes and multiple recipes. There's no one defining factor. If you look in the paper we list, it can be used for this, and this. So they have like multiple uses. They were very versatile ingredients. Obviously, that was what was available. But yes, that would have been one. A lubricant property would have been one of them, but they were also used for consumption for something different. So yeah, they would have used them in various different ways, which maybe aided the fact that we could then find them on the girdle.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Okay. All right. Let's get into the human stuff because this is interesting to me. What kind of human proteins did you find on this? So you've given us a clue. Can you give us the range of what kind of human protein you found on it?
So, yeah, I mean, we have to broadly speak of sort of trends. So no one protein is going to sort of give it away because you're basically finding metabolic proteins. So these proteins are often found in numerous different tissues or fluids in your body. So you have to take it in a sort of global sense. Though very much, obviously when we do this analysis, we're comparing it to a control document and to a blank, and what we could see was there was a much larger proportion of human proteins in the birth girdle versus our control document, which is like an 18th century legal document. So that already indicated that it was more intensely used or handled or worn by a person. But then when taking this whole suite of proteins that we found, what we did was compare them to different tissues. So on the suspicion that it was a birth girdle, then obviously we compared it to things like blood, to amniotic fluid, to various other tissues. But what it most heavily matched, or what it most looked like, was actually cervicovaginal fluid. So this would seem to indicate, rather than it being used directly in labor, where you might expect more amniotic fluid or blood, this would seem to indicate it was being worn during the pregnancy, presumably later pregnancy. And that is what you are finding. It was probably wrapped around the pregnant woman, worn as a girdle. And that sort of intimate contact is what we seem to be registering there in the proteins that we found.
Yes. And this is the part that was mind-blowing to me, because having looked at this just from a manuscript perspective, or the things that we've been able to assume just by looking at descriptions of this, it was always called a birth girdle. And there was always this idea that you'd wear it kind of around the belly while you're giving birth. You probably don't want to wear it kind of as a loincloth giving birth. It's going to get in the way.
Yes.
But the idea that people had always had was that you were wearing it during the birth. And I think possibly this had to do with some of the protections or some of the saints that are invoked, like Saint Margaret, the patron saint of actual childbirth. So this is very exciting to find out that women were wearing this before they gave birth.
Yeah, that's what the evidence seemed to indicate. Of course, that doesn't exclude at all that they would continue to use it during labour, presumably unbound and then just sort of placed perhaps over the belly while they were giving birth to have it still close to them while giving birth. But yeah, the sort of human side seems to indicate that it was probably pre-labour, probably in later stages of pregnancy. But there is, again, a sort of historical evidence for them to suggest that it would have been worn as a physical support for this like extra pregnancy weight. So it wouldn't be unusual to think that they were wearing it beforehand.
Yes, I mean,
probably not for 9 months, but
probably not for 9 months. Well, because you have to rent it, right?
Yeah, exactly. It could be quite expensive.
Yeah, well, we have to remember that with the garments of the time, nobody has anything that is really going to be supporting that extra weight. But I think even the idea of supporting the extra weight doesn't necessarily imply that you're wearing it exactly next to the body. But this experiment can tell us that they're wearing it right close to the body. And that makes sense when you think about how closely they want the symbols on it or the prayers on it to be as close as possible to their own bodies and the body of their children.
I think that's exactly right. It's that physicality. It's reflecting physically what you want. You want the safety for yourself, for your unborn child. You want to wear them as close as possible. Yeah, I think that's, apart from the sort of the physical function of it, that would have been, very much sort of talismanic effect.
Yes. And you mentioned in the article that I think you took 8 different samples. Did you find that it was consistent where you'd find the patterns of these proteins? I mean, there's only so many ways you could probably wear this, but did you find that it was mostly in the same spot that you would find these proteins?
No, there was some differentiation. So some of the proteins we would find throughout these 8 different samples, but some were more specific. The honey we found in only one particular location, for example, whereas, some of the cereals were more distributed. But again, it was only 8 samples in a 3-meter long girdle. So had we maybe sampled more, we might have found it in more areas. We don't know. So we couldn't really go into like what that means based on that sampling. But yeah, it's not necessarily all consistent.
That's interesting because I think in the article, again, we're going to post this for people to look at. You have like different configurations for how you could actually wear this.
Yeah, that's us trying to just figure out in our heads because we don't really know. There isn't a documentary source that says this is exactly how you would wear a girdle. So we just, we've created an image saying, well, these are the possible ways that it could have been worn that would give way to this kind of evidence and how you would probably wear it pre-labor and then maybe during labor.
And is this something that you kind of worked out by looking at the folds in it, like looking at the folds of an old map? I don't know if people look at maps anymore, but like we used to always, when I was refolding them in school, learning how to refold a map, I always looked at those creases and which ones were worn out to figure out how to fold it.
No, unfortunately, no, not as directly as that. You can see that, that the roll now is actually rolled up and it would have been kept as a roll when it was not in use. So obviously you have those folds or that composition. We can't tell exactly from the folds, but you could see that it had been heavily sort of manipulated and stretched and worn around. So those are based more on just, textual sources that say describe, how it might have been worn or what the purpose was. Therefore, that's our assumption.
So no one was trying them on in the lab?
No. These rolls also obviously in a very delicate state and we need to, preserve them as well as we can. So all the sampling was done by a conservator in the Wellcome, Stefania, and very obviously with a lot of care because it's a beautiful object but requires very gentle handling.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I need to ask you the question that I think people are going to get upset if I don't ask. And that is, if you're looking at DNA, can you figure out how many people used this?
I'm tentatively going to say no. We don't tend to look at human DNA anyway for a plethora of reasons. I mean, we are more focused on animal and other biomolecules. Also, you've got handling. This has been handled over the years. Even when it's not used as a birth girdle, it would have passed on, from libraries to curators, people. So you have a veritable palimpsest there of human people who have touched this. So it'd be, I think, very, very hard to say anything about that. It's not something we're going to be looking at the moment.
That's not like CSI Medieval, right?
Yeah, no. It's not as easy as here, you take this, put it in a machine, you get a result. No, it's a little bit harder to decipher. And yeah, I think something that we can't really say.
Yeah. I'm sure that there were going to be people curious about this who are going to be trying to figure this out later, though.
I'm sure, yes. Well, good luck to them.
Yeah, this is why you're staying out of it, staying on the protein side, right?
Very much so.
Well, I need to ask the question. As a scientist, you're going in with an open mind, but was there anything that you were possibly expecting to find on this and didn't find?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, we initially, this was very much a pilot study that we didn't really know what we were going to find. So because up until then, we had been exclusively working on collagen and doing species ID, we weren't sure that we were going to find anything of use, to be honest. So we were just really gratefully surprised that we were able to detect all this grave evidence. I think possibly the only one that I would have thought maybe was some more blood proteins, evidence of blood, because I feel that's like something common that would have appeared. But again, as we said, if it's not necessarily in closer contact during labor, maybe not. But that's probably the one that I thought maybe we would have found that we didn't.
Which makes me ask the question, when you were finding samples, did you target places that were stained? You're like, oh, this is a stain. It might be a blood stain. Can we use that?
Yeah, so when Stefania was doing all the sampling, she sort of judged where she thought, there was evidence of staining or abrasion. We also targeted a few areas that weren't supposedly stained to see if there was a difference. But yeah, there didn't seem, like I said, we thought maybe those would be the particular ones, but it turned out there wasn't that much of a difference. It was more sort of distributed than we initially thought.
That's very exciting. I think that I would be, if I was a scientist, be pointing to that stain saying, okay, what's that one? We want to find out what that is. But as you say, you need to have those controls. And I think that's important. You mentioned that you can't, as people who are being respectful of this parchment, you can't actually take these samples from ink places. So these are places that don't have ink on them. Do you think that would make much of a difference, or probably not at all?
I don't know. That's a good question. We always avoid any areas with writing, especially in a very degraded document, but in just all the ones we do, because we don't want to hinder anything that could potentially be of use for people further down the line. And for us, clear parchment is more than sufficient. I don't think in this case it would necessarily make a difference, because it's written all over the birth girdle, so where we're targeting sort of margins and things like that. So there wouldn't have been a huge amount of difference when it was worn from one area to the other. So I don't think in this case it would make any difference, but we don't know.
Yeah, I was thinking more about the locations of it. Like, did you have to avoid any locations that could have been exciting?
I mean, yeah, obviously, where the images are, again, those are the potentially very interesting areas, because they are great, and they've been sort of like, it seems evidence of touching them or kissing them, because these are the more venerated areas. So you would suspect that there might find some more interesting proteins, maybe something to do with saliva, or if they've been kissing them, things like that. But obviously we couldn't go anywhere near the images, so we had to stay clear. But I think given that we were targeting blank areas and we still found all of this, seems to indicate that, yeah, there's a lot of information, especially in areas that you don't necessarily see an obvious stain. We still were able to detect proteins. So I think there's a lot to be said about targeting blank areas.
Yeah, I think that's important to mention, because parchment is very expensive and putting together these things is very expensive, but that doesn't mean that people didn't use them. People are using books, people are using parchment in all sorts of ways. It is something that is getting touched and handled all the time, especially something that's being worn.
Yes, no, exactly. And there's a very sort of, I think, also a tactile element to it as well. So yeah, they're very much in use and handled by people. And you can see that evidence often in the way, some documents are heavily handled. You can see that there are corners that have been heavily thumbed darker. Kate Rudy has done a lot of work in analysing this. And yeah, it's really interesting to see, what pages in a book, for example, are people handling more than others? And does that, what's the text that's written on there? And just that you can do that just by visually observing this. So yeah, I mean, these are objects that need to be handled and worn. They weren't just kept on the shelf.
Yeah, and it's good for them too. For the people who have not heard the white gloves thing, you shouldn't use white gloves when you're handling parchment.
Yeah, don't use white gloves. However, and this is the scientists that are talking, when we do our sampling, we do ask our conservators to wear nitrile gloves, just to avoid their own keratin, their own skin proteins contaminating our sample. But it's only for that sampling. But yeah, for handling, it's always better to use your fingers. And we take that into account. This is something that obviously we know, or manuscripts and documents, parchments have been handled throughout their life, and that's going to make up part of their story. So we take that into account, and it doesn't affect us for our analysis. We just, we're aware of that. But of course, this is where, things like, if you want to get the DNA of the people, that's why we say, look, it's a very confusing signal because of all this handling. It becomes like a palimpsest effectively, and you can't decipher it. So it has both sides to it. But yeah, if you want to handle it carefully, don't wear white gloves.
Yes. So you've controlled for this. So this isn't the conservator having honey for lunch.
No. Well, at least we hope not. No, very much so. No. All of our sampling is done with gloves. Nice.
So without spilling the tea on anybody else's research, after having done this particular project, what are the implications for it? So what are the implications for you as a scientist, and what are the implications for medieval studies?
So I think for us, this was just the first time that we, demonstrated that you could get this whole other suite of proteins apart from, your species analysis through collagen. We could actually find direct biomolecular evidence on historic documents using a non-invasive method. So it just basically opens the doors now to all these other, untapped documents. What can we find out? So instead of just routinely doing our species ID, can we start to think about what are the other proteins on these books and what that can tell us about history and use and the life cycles of these objects? I mean, particularly stained ones, obviously, that we're interested in, but yeah, it just opens the door to a lot of potential. And that's where, we want scholars to come with their questions and what they've been working on, and where we can find a consensus, say, oh yeah, well, this is actually an interesting one for us to target because we can say such and such. We can't say other things. Obviously, we can't solve everything, but I'm sure there's lots of stories out there that we can sort of help with. And that's what we kind of always do in our work in biocodicology. We're very much a team of people. So we always have the scientists, the conservators, and the scholars working together to see what are the kind of questions that are around, but what can we answer with these techniques?
So has your phone been ringing off the hook since Kalamazoo?
Well, we have had, various other offers of similar sort of birthing girdles that we would really like to do, that looks sort of slightly different. So they have their own little twist. It's been really great. The reception we've had over the years with our technique and with questions that we've been looking for, we've been blown away by the acceptance. People have been very generous with, offering samples and telling us about different questions and what we can look for. So it's been great. And I think, over time, people are starting to know more about biocodicology, that like people have heard of it now, and they're starting to think about, how these sort of techniques can be used to answer questions that maybe perhaps a decade ago were sort of not thought possible to answer. Now we can start to think about how we can go about answering them.
Yeah, I love seeing the science advance, and I love seeing the community come together, because people in medieval studies are so generous with their time and research.
Yes, very much so. Like I said, none of this would have been possible if it was purely us as scientists just doing our techniques. It's always worked this way because we have this really great community and very generous collaborators and colleagues who have managed to bring this all together. And I feel very lucky to be working in very interdisciplinary, but for me, incredibly enjoyable field of manuscripts and science.
Yeah, I love to see this coming together. And who would have thought those eraser crumbs, no one is going to look at them the same way again after this.
I know. I feel like, this is the one selling point. Everybody's like, wow, the eraser, just these little crumbs. I'm like, yeah, it's amazing. So next time you are writing something in pencil and you rub it out, to spare a thought for future biocodicologists, who are collecting these crumbs. And what we would say is, like, if conservators are actually cleaning parchments, don't throw away your crumbs. Please do collect them, because you never know when they could be of use.
Yeah, I think you've demonstrated that perfectly. Well, thank you so much, Sarah, for coming on to talk about this research. It is fascinating, and I hope it's going to lead to all sorts of new directions for the field and for your work. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure.
To find out more about Sarah's work, you can visit her faculty webpage at arch.cam.ac.uk/staff/Dr.Sarah-Fiddyment. Or you can follow her on Twitter at Dr. S. Fiddyment. You can find the Beasts to Craft project on Twitter at ERCB2C. And we'll have the URL for it, along with a few of Sarah's other fascinating papers, including her field guide to biocodicology, on the page for this episode at medievalists.net. Before we go, here's Peter from medievalists.net to tell us what's on the website. What's going on, Peter?
Well, I'm now in Leeds, for the...
You're jet setting around.
I'm a world traveler. The world is entirely within England, but I'm at Leeds for the International Medieval Congress. It's one of the big conferences of medieval studies. It's been a few years since they've had it open and not online, and so I'm really glad to be there.
Yeah, it's such a great conference. There are so many good people just telling you all the latest stuff. It's just awesome.
Indeed. And I will be talking about Patreon and how other medievalists can make use of it, because, we do well on our Patreon.
I'm always so grateful to the people who are patrons on Patreon because they make it possible to actually put this podcast out every week. So I'm super grateful to those people. So it's great that you're spreading the word, Peter.
Thanks. And meanwhile, we're still pumping out content. We have this really interesting piece by George Theotokos about a siege of Constantinople.
Nice.
And I know you think, well, there's lots of sieges, right? But this...
Constantinople? Yes.
So this is a siege that may not have happened, actually, from the 7th century. And he's discussing, did it actually even take place? Because the historiography is a little off on it.
Ooh, cool.
So we've got that. We've got Lucy Lemonnier talking about the labors of the month. Always a good time for that.
Mm-hmm.
And finally, I have a piece on astral magic and how you can get Mars to help you out.
I've always wanted to know how to get Mars to help me out.
Especially if you're fighting wars.
Well, thank you, Peter, and have a great time at the conference.
Thanks.
Thank you to all of Medievalist.net's patrons on patreon.com for your generous support each month. Patrons can access all sorts of cool stuff like subscriptions to the Medieval Magazine and Medieval World Magazine, as well as a book club and exclusive maps by Tina Ross. Your patronage directly funds this podcast as well as Medievalist.net's other work, so thank you. To get in on the action, please visit patreon.com/medievalists. For everything from biology to bibliography, follow Medievalist.net on Facebook or Twitter at Medievalists. You can find me, Danièle Cybulski, across social media at 5MIN Medievalist or 5 Minute Medievalist. And you can find my books at all your favorite bookstores, where you can get hold of How to Live Like a Monk, Medieval Wisdom for Modern Life, in hardcover, ebook, and audiobook. Our music is Beyond the Warriors by Geefrog. Thanks for listening, and have yourself a lovely day.